Whispers of a new global conflict are no longer confined to think tanks or classified military briefings. They're echoing through newsrooms, markets, and diplomatic corridors worldwide. For the first time in decades, NATO finds itself staring down a power it was never designed to confront: China. What began as a series of distant trade disputes and maritime standoffs has morphed into something far more dangerous: joint war games, military posturing, and threats that feel uncomfortably real. In capitals from Washington to Beijing, the language has shifted from negotiation to deterrence. And in the background, the unspoken question grows louder. Is the world edging toward a confrontation that could ignite the first true great power war of the 21st century? It began with scattered reports. A Chinese naval flotilla spotted moving through contested waters in the South China Sea. NATO reconnaissance aircraft making unusually close passes near Asian airspace. At first, they seemed like isolated incidents, the kind of posturing both sides have engaged in for years. But this time, something was different. The pace of military activity accelerated. The tone of official statements hardened, and, within weeks, the turning point came when multiple intelligence leaks suggested that Beijing was preparing a full-spectrum response to NATO's expanding presence in the Indo-Pacific. Almost overnight, foreign ministries across the world were on high alert. Financial markets trembled as oil and commodity prices surged, and media headlines began to echo the same chilling phrase: fear of World War III. For NATO, this confrontation is unlike anything in its history, a test of strength and unity against a rival with unmatched economic weight and growing military reach. For China, it is a battle for influence, sovereignty, and the rules of the 21st century world order. And for everyone else, it is a dangerous reminder that peace is never guaranteed. For most of its existence, NATO's gaze was fixed firmly on Europe and the North Atlantic. Born from the ashes of World War II, its mission was simple: contain the Soviet Union and protect its member states from communist expansion. China was a distant player in that story. A rising power, yes, but far from NATO's immediate horizon. That began to change in the early 21st century. As Beijing's economy surged, so too did its military capabilities. The Belt and Road Initiative extended China's influence into Europe's backyard, while its navy pushed further into contested waters in the Pacific and Indian Oceans. NATO, once a regional alliance, started speaking the language of global security. The real shift came when NATO formally named China a systemic challenge, a designation once reserved for Russia alone. What followed was a series of quiet but significant moves: intelligence sharing with Pacific allies, joint exercises in the South China Sea, and public statements framing Beijing's policies as threats to international stability. For China, this was more than rhetoric. It was encirclement. And, in Beijing's view, NATO's eastward attention is not defensive at all. It's a prelude to confrontation. The crisis hit its tipping point in late August. During what NATO described as a freedom of navigation operation, a multinational naval group sailed through the Taiwan Strait, a move Beijing called a blatant violation of its sovereignty. Chinese state television broadcast live footage of fighter jets shadowing the NATO vessels, while missile batteries on the mainland were placed on visible alert. The response from Beijing was immediate and uncompromising. The Chinese Defense Ministry declared that any foreign military presence in these waters will be met with decisive action. Hours later, satellite images revealed the mobilization of amphibious assault ships and long-range missile units along China's southeastern coast. What made this incident different from past standoffs was its scale. It wasn't a single NATO member acting independently. It was a coordinated show of force involving multiple alliance navies. Beijing saw it as proof that NATO intended to extend its influence deep into Asia, far beyond its traditional boundaries. And when it came to bombs, diplomatic hotlines lit up, but neither side showed signs of retreat. In capitals around the world, analysts warned that the Taiwan Strait had just become the most dangerous flashpoint on Earth. one miscalculation away from sparking a global conflict. Beijing's countermove was swift, layered, and carefully choreographed to send a message far beyond the Pacific. Within 24 hours of the NATO operation, the People's Liberation Army launched its largest live-fire drills in the Taiwan Strait in over a decade. Warships formed a blockade-style formation, while fighter squadrons conducted simulated strikes on hostile vessels. State media broadcast the exercises non-stop, framing them as a rehearsal for repelling an invasion. At the same time, China moved to fortify its strategic alliances. High-level envoys were dispatched to Moscow, Tehran, and several Southeast Asian capitals, seeking to strengthen military and economic coordination in anticipation of prolonged tension with NATO. In a rare public statement, President Xi Jinping declared that China will never accept encirclement, and any attempt to contain us will fail. Economic tools were also deployed. Beijing announced export restrictions on rare earth minerals, crucial to Western defense industries, a move that sent shockwaves through NATO supply chains. In parallel, the yuan was promoted as a settlement currency in energy deals with major partners, further chipping away at Western financial leverage. It was a calculated blend of military muscle, diplomatic outreach, and economic pressure, signaling China was prepared for a long confrontation. NATO's reaction was equally rapid and designed to project unity. Within days, an emergency session was held in Brussels, where member states unanimously agreed to increase their presence in the Indo-Pacific. Carrier strike groups from the United States, the United Kingdom, and France were placed on extended deployment orders, while advanced surveillance aircraft were stationed in bases across Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines. Ouch! Publicly, NATO leaders framed these moves as defensive measures aimed at preserving freedom of navigation and deterring aggression. Privately, officials acknowledged the intent was to demonstrate that the alliance could operate effectively on China's doorstep. Cybersecurity units were also mobilized, tasked with monitoring and countering potential Chinese cyber intrusions targeting NATO infrastructure. NATO has learned from NATO, leadership says, targeting cyber intrusions. Targeting NATO, targeting cyber. Economic coordination followed. Several member states began discussing synchronized sanctions packages targeting Chinese state-owned enterprises tied to defense production. The alliance also sought to deepen cooperation with regional partners like Australia and India, inviting them into joint drills and intelligence sharing programs. By combining military posture, economic planning, and alliance diplomacy, NATO sent an unmistakable signal. It was willing to meet China's challenge head-on, even if it meant stretching the alliance's mandate far beyond its traditional sphere. The rest of the world watched the NATO-China standoff with a mix of alarm and opportunism. In Europe, some governments urged caution, warning that an extended confrontation could fracture global trade and push neutral states toward Beijing's orbit. Meanwhile, in Asia, nations like Vietnam and the Philippines quietly welcomed NATO's presence as a counterbalance, while others, including Indonesia and Malaysia, Moscow seized the moment, publicly supporting China's stance and offering joint military exercises aimed at ensuring multipolar stability. In the Middle East, major oil exporters signaled a willingness to conduct more energy deals in yuan, a subtle nod toward China's growing economic influence. Global markets reacted nervously. Energy prices spiked, shipping insurance rates soared, and investors shifted toward safe haven assets. The confrontation was no longer a regional dispute. It was reshaping the world's strategic and economic map in real time. Analysts warn that the NATO-China confrontation is approaching a point where even a minor incident could trigger an uncontrollable chain reaction. One scenario involves a collision or misfire in the Taiwan Strait, a single mistake that could spiral into open conflict. Another possibility is economic warfare on an unprecedented scale, with both sides imposing sweeping trade bans and currency restrictions that could fracture global supply chains. There's also the risk of proxy clashes. Strategic choke points like the South China Sea, the Strait of Malacca, or even Africa's Red Sea corridor could see indirect confrontations through Allied forces. The most alarming prospect, however, is a direct escalation involving cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, crippling communications, power grids, or defense systems. In each case, the margin for diplomacy shrinks. The world is left wondering whether the current standoff is a test of resolve or the opening chapter of a far more dangerous war. As the standoff stretches on, both NATO and China remain locked in a dangerous game of endurance. Every maneuver, every statement, is weighed not just for its immediate effect, but for the message it sends to allies and rivals alike. In the shadows, diplomats work frantically to cool tempers, yet the machinery of escalation grinds forward. The fear is no longer abstract. It is present in every tense headline and market tremor. Whether this ends in a negotiated settlement or ignites a global conflict will depend on choices made in the days ahead. Choices history will never forget.